These podcasts are being released in conjunction with the 5th National Climate Assessment. They feature conversations among NCA authors and staff about the report, the science behind the report, and the participants' experiences and perspectives. They do not represent official positions of the United States government. Enjoy!
Welcome to the companion podcast of the 5th National Climate Assessment. In the past 4 episodes, we've taken you on a journey through the complex world of climate science and climate change within the United States, and hopefully made it just a little less complex for you. Today, we're stepping back from the nitty-gritty details and diving into the bigger picture of the future of climate science and climate action in the United States. We're widening the lens a bit to look beyond just the 5th National Climate Assessment and explore what the next 30 years might look like as our knowledge and our collective response to climate change advances. We've talked extensively about the 5th National Climate Assessment, or NCA5, which is a comprehensive report that provides us with a snapshot of the impacts of climate change today, as well as what's expected in the future. It's an essential resource for understanding the challenges we face. But how can we use this assessment to make informed choices in our everyday lives when it comes to climate change? Imagine this. You're at home, you're wondering what steps you can take to contribute to a more sustainable future. The National Climate Assessment is your guide, your roadmap. It tells you not only what's happening right now, also what's on the horizon over the next 30 years and beyond, and what type of actions can lead to different futures for our environment and our communities and our homes. As our conversations around climate change evolve, they're increasingly focused on solutions. We're not just discussing the problems anymore, we're actively seeking ways to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change to build our community resilience. The goal of NCA5 and future climate assessments is to help provide data and insights that can help you decide where your efforts will have the most significant impact. In this last episode of our limited series, I want to first take a step back and think about how NCA5 fits into the history of climate science and climate assessments, and where we might be headed for NCA6 or NCA7 or even NCA10. To help me do this, I will be joined by the NCA4 director and NCA5 author, David Reidmiller, to talk about the past national climate assessments, what is new in this current NCA, and the potential of the assessments still to come. Then we'll talk about how the NCA fits into your world. How can people, perhaps someone like you, use the assessment to make meaningful choices, especially in the face of the unique climate risks they might be facing? I'll be joined by NCA contributors Zeke, Hausfather, and Julian, Reyes to help us think about how the NCA can empower you to take actions and make choices within your own life. As our conversations around climate change center more and more around solutions, how might our adaptation and mitigation actions evolve to meet those changing needs? We'll talk to NCA authors Rebecca Dotter and A.R. Siders to get our creative juices flowing around the actions we can take in response to climate change. And finally, we'll end this series with a conversation with the executive director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, Mike Cooperberg, to think about how the next 30 years of global change research across the government might evolve. We'll talk to him about his hopes for how this NCA and future assessments can help our nation and the world, and importantly, how you can be a part of it. So let's dive in.
Coming up.
We always want the National Climate Assessment to be a decision support tool, but at the same time, what it's really done is really shown a bright light on what some of the emergent risks are and what other communities are doing to respond. And so there's a huge knowledge transfer exercise that goes on as a result of the National Climate Assessment.
NCAs have evolved over time to meet the needs of the moment. Former NCA4 director David Reidmiller joins Allison to discuss what NCAs have been in the past, how NCA5 fits into that evolution, and what future NCAs will look like as the experience of living through climate change continues to evolve.
Our next guest probably needs no introduction to folks who are familiar with the National Climate Assessment. It is Dr. Dave Reidmiller from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, who was the director of the fourth National Climate Assessment and also previously acting director of the Northeast and Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers with the U.S. Geological Survey. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We're really excited to have you. And I think it's particularly exciting because you have a pretty unique position. You were the director of NCA4 and also an author on NCA5. So I'd love to start off asking you just what has been different about NCA5 compared to NCA4?
It's hard to know where to begin with that question. There's a range of ways to answer that. I think one of the biggest ones I would just say is the context in which we're operating in. NCA4 began at the very end of the Obama administration and carried through the Trump administration. And those respective administrations placed very different priorities on climate science and climate action as a priority. And as a result, the attention the process got and the priority that agencies were giving to it is quite different. At the same time, in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen significant advances in subnational climate action, and in particular, in the past couple of years, significant federal action in climate action. And so I think just in that broad context, there's one big difference. Another big difference has been the increasing focus on equity and justice in the climate conversation. And NCA5 has done a phenomenal job of really elevating those two issues in ways, frankly, that we probably didn't have as much literature to assess in NCA4, and now there's a really robust body of knowledge out there that we can bring forward into the public sphere.
Are there other advances in the science that you've seen just since 2018, since NCA4 came out, that are captured in NCA5?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones we've certainly seen is sort of the extreme event attribution science. We historically have been able to do that in a statistical sense, but it would take quite some time to do that analysis. And now you're getting almost near real-time event attribution.
Can you help our listeners understand a little bit more what you mean when you say extreme event attribution?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously throughout history, the world has experienced extreme events, whether they be hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, heat waves, you name it. But what we're seeing, of course, is that the frequency, intensity, extent, duration of these events is increasing in many respects and in many places around the world. And what we can do now is really attribute how much of that event has been intensified as a result of anthropogenic climate change. So is the heat wave, say, 20% stronger as a result of anthropogenic climate change? Did that hurricane drop 15% more rainfall over Houston than it would have been without anthropogenic climate change? Those are the types of things that we're able to do now in near real time.
I would love to hear, especially from your experience on NCA4, what are some of the ways that you saw the National Climate Assessment used after it was released?
We always want the National Climate Assessment to be a decision support tool, and I think it's something we've really struggled with, to provide sort of the granularity of information that's oftentimes needed at the local level to catalyze action. But at the same time, what it's really done is really shown a bright light on what some of the emergent risks are and what other communities are doing to respond. And so there's a huge knowledge transfer exercise that goes on as a result of the National Climate Assessment. And by having hundreds of authors involved, you have ambassadors around the country to sort of talk about what is captured in this report and to really inform their decision makers who frankly probably aren't going to pick up a 1,500 page, 2,000 page report, however long it is this time around, to really thumb through it. And having these kind of ambassadors, if you will, these climate ambassadors, really take those messages into the public discourse is hugely valuable. And we saw that in the wake of NCA4. A great example was out in Honolulu, and with the Hawaii and U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands chapter, the author team there did two really valuable things. One was that they had a deeply inclusive process to sort of elicit what stakeholders wanted to see in that chapter. So it really was a stakeholder-driven process from the start. And secondly, in the wake of it, they then had a very community-driven assessment of climate impacts and potential response options in that region. And the lead authors of that chapter took that into the public discourse. They talked to the mayor of Honolulu. They've really worked on some local ordinance language and things of that sort. So it's exactly what you want to see happen in a lot of ways. And I think it serves as a model for other chapters to follow in other regions and other sectors.
And how do you see NCA5 being used, whether in the Northeast or elsewhere across the US?
One of the most valuable things about the National Climate Assessment that probably doesn't get the attention that it deserves is that it really serves as the foundation for climate science and climate information across the country. And what I mean by that is that one of the biggest uses for it is in designing curriculum. And so one of the things we would hear when we would go to, say, the American Geophysical Union's fall meeting, we would hear from all these community college professors saying, "Thank you so much for the National Climate Assessment." That basically provided me with a semester's worth of content. So there's a huge role to be had from the National Climate Assessment in sort of raising awareness among the next generation of climate leaders. And I think it's critically important that they not only get an understanding of the basic science, what's happening in the Earth system, but importantly, connecting that to what people care about. And that's, I think, where the NCA really thrives, is having that community-driven process that really elicits the values and priorities of the people we are charged with responding to.
We talked about NCA4, we talked about NCA5, and how those were developed under very different times from a political perspective, a scientific perspective. Even NCA5 was kind of written during COVID, during the pandemic. So, really different situations under which these assessments were developed. Curious if you have any thoughts about where our country's headed and what needs we might have that NCA6 will have to evolve to meet.
The needs are dynamic, right? And I think that makes it really important to kind of sustain that engagement and that dialogue, not just with the scientific community and the broader public, but importantly, decision makers at all levels. And that doesn't just mean state, regional, and municipal governments. It also means the private sector. Increasingly, you're starting to see regulations and even voluntary disclosures of not just fence line and broader operational greenhouse gas emissions, but also their climate risk exposure. And I think it's really important for us to understand what that risk exposure is. And so I think one of the biggest kind of challenges going forward is going to be kind of grappling with that risk, right? Everybody has a different level of risk tolerance. And embedded within that, of course, is the inherent uncertainty associated with climate science and projections out over multiple decades. And so trying to develop tools or methods or frameworks or experiences where effective decision making is made in light of uncertainty and sort of in a prudent risk framework is going to be really, really important. And I think the extent to which we can draw upon experiences that companies and cities and towns and even local property owners and people who just enjoy experiencing the environment, it's going to be really important that we get a handle on how they think about risk, how they think about uncertainty, and what can be done about it.
Going back to what you said about NCA6 and the private sector, as you were talking, I can kind of see that line from NCA4, which, as you well know, included some of the first economic impacts in NCA4, and in particular, kind of the direct damages from climate change. And then in NCA5, we built on that and developed a whole economic chapter that talks about those damages, but also expands it into other fields like finance and what it means for a community who are planning their own mitigation and adaptation efforts, or what it means at a household income level. And so I can see that line being drawn then again to NCA6 and thinking about the financial impacts and risk that might be included in a future assessment.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest headlines coming out of NCA4 was that the costs of inaction are orders of magnitude larger than the cost of action. And like you said, I think we've put an even greater spotlight on that issue of economics around climate change in NCA5. And I think moving into NCA6 and beyond, I would love to see even more private sector engagement, really focusing on the risk and exposure to domestic supply chains, to international supply chains for that matter. And importantly, what companies are doing about it, right? We have more and more certified B corporations in the country that are, leading the way on environmental, social, and governance issues. And there's a lot to be learned, and a lot of it can be done in a very cost-effective way.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been really great talking to you.
It's been a pleasure and superb work leading this. This has been a really wonderful experience, and it's been just an absolute joy to kind of sit in the backseat and see new leadership at the helm and carry this torch forward, just as I did in the wake of Kathy Jacobs' leadership.
Coming up.
So we really need to think about climate as a risk management problem. And so it's really important when we look at scenarios that we look at a wide variety of models, a wide variety of emission scenarios, so we can give stakeholders and other users of this data a real sense of what the range of possible outcomes might be, what the best case and what the worst case might be.
Making choices in the face of new challenges is inherently tricky. NCA5 participants Zeke Hausfather and Julian Reyes join us after the break to talk about how NCA5 can help you do just that.
Our next segment is going to be about how the National Climate Assessment can help you make choices. And I'm joined today by Zeke Hausfather, who is a climate research lead at Stripe and a research scientist at Berkeley Earth. And I'm also joined by Julian Reyes, who's the Deputy Director for Climate Services at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So I think if we were going to be super reductionist about it, the National Climate Assessment can be summed up as a really big report about climate change in the U.S. But as we've talked about in previous episodes and with Dave Reidmiller as well, it's actually so much more. The National Climate Assessment is really a tool that people around the country can use to make decisions about the climate risks they're facing. So that's what I'm excited to talk to you both about today. And Zeke, let me start with you. You spend a lot of your time working on future climate change and understanding the different potential futures that we all might face based on the choices we are making today. Can you talk about how climate modelers explore a range of potential pathways and why it's so important, especially from a risk assessment point of view, to have an understanding of that range of potential futures?
So when we're looking at future climate changes, we're really dealing with three different sets of uncertainties in the climate system. The first is the one we can control, which is our emissions. But there's other uncertainties in the climate system that we don't have direct control over. One big one is what we call climate sensitivity, which is effectively how much does the climate respond to our emissions. And then the final one, which is quite important, and we discuss at length in the National Climate Assessment, is carbon cycle feedbacks. And so the combination of these different things, the different emission choices we make, the potential range of sensitivity of the climate to our emissions, and the uncertainties in how the carbon cycle responds to our emissions, means that we can't know precisely exactly how much it's going to warm based on our choices. And that means we really need to think about climate as a risk management problem. And so it's really important when we look at scenarios that we look at a wide variety of models, a wide variety of emission scenarios, so we can give stakeholders and other users of this data a real sense of what the range of possible outcomes might be, what the best case and what the worst case might be. One of the bits of good news that we highlight in the National Climate Assessment that was also highlighted in the most recent IPCC report is that there's an increasing amount of evidence from our models that we are largely in control of the amount of warming that will happen this century. And models tend to show that once we get our emissions all the way down to zero, which is a big task. We have a lot of work to do to get there. But once we get our emissions all the way down to zero, warming more or less immediately stops. There's not a huge amount of warming that's in the pipeline that's inevitable. It's necessarily going to lead to us exceeding our global temperature targets that the world has set. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that warming is not the only impact of climate change. And obviously, there's many cases in which we end up at a temperature that is not optimal by the time we get emissions to zero. So we may have a lot of work to do to bring global temperatures back down by removing more carbon from the atmosphere than we add.
Julian, let me turn to you next and ask what other kinds of decisions are people around the country facing where having access to this kind of information that Zeke just described would be so critical?
So my background is more in agriculture and natural resources, and I spent quite a number of years with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners are really near and dear to my heart. One example in the agricultural space is using climate information to better understand the wide range of possible climate impacts. And as Zeke mentioned, for farmers and ranchers to really plan for that wide range, which really helps their risk management strategies, both in the near term, but also the long term. And that's super important to protect their bottom line, but also their livelihoods. of which is really dependent on these natural resources that are affected by changes in the climate, whether that's more extreme rainfall or higher temperatures.
And certainly, if you're deciding to build the structure right now near the coast, knowing how sea levels are going to change over the next 50 years is pretty critical to your decision. And this sort of climate data can be really important for those things.
And I think the value of the National Climate Assessment, especially thinking about climate services, is that we can ensure that the information that's being used from the National Climate Assessment is representative of what those people on the ground really need, thinking about communities, the end users of the report.
Outside of your day jobs, have you used climate data for some decision that you were facing in your lives?
As someone who lives in California and has been impacted by sort of the emerging era of mega fires here, I decided to move houses a few years back into a more forested area. And I definitely spent a bit of time looking at the latest forecasts of wildfire risk from some of these climate data services in these regions. There's obviously a lot of trade-offs in deciding where you want to live, but certainly as we enter a world of more climate extremes, having informed knowledge of the risks you're going to be facing in an area are increasingly important. And so it's certainly useful for things like that.
Yes, I have used climate data in some personal decisions. It's a bit sadder than Zeke's answer, but I think looking at a lot of our cultural and natural resources and thinking about what's going to happen to them into the future, looking at our national parks, many of the assets, natural, cultural, may not survive into the future. And so I use that to figure out which national parks to visit now when they may not exist in the future.
Coming up.
One of the challenges with thinking more transformatively is that it can be inequitable. It can have even bigger changes if that sort of transformation, that shift in the fundamental system, doesn't take into account everyone's best interests.
As we mentioned in our previous episodes, the National Climate Assessment is intentionally policy neutral. I get asked a lot about how the report can possibly talk about climate actions like mitigation and adaptation without being policy prescriptive. And the way that we do this in the National Climate Assessment is by framing our conversation in an if-then sort of framework. So if we want to reach this outcome or limit warming to this specific level, then these actions would be required. And if we want to reach a different outcome, then these other actions would be required. The key to this is that the choice, how much greenhouse gases we emit and how much further warming we experience, is really up to us. The information in the assessment allows us to understand the outcomes of these different choices. In this next segment, I'll be speaking with two authors about the actions that might be needed if we want to limit warming and avoid the worst impacts of climate change to the US. I am joined today by two leading experts on this subject. Rebecca Dotter is the Associate National Program Director for the Air, Climate, and Energy Program at the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and she is the coordinating lead of our mitigation chapter. I'm also joined by A.R. Siders, who is a social scientist and associate professor at the University of Delaware and an author on our adaptation chapter. We've talked a lot, both in the report and in our previous podcast episodes, about all of the mitigation and adaptation measures that are already taking place all around the country. But we also know, of course, that there is a gap between where we are now and where we might need to be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And Rebecca, maybe I'll start with you. Can you first describe for us where to aim if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change?
So to really avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we know that globally, we need to get our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by around mid-century. And this means reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether CO2, methane, or other greenhouse gases, as far down as possible to zero. And so to get to net zero, we're trying to get to a balance between those emissions and between our carbon sinks. And this means really taking bold and decisive actions now. And we have a lot of the tools in place to really sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Can you tell me about some of those tools? What do we have in our toolbox to reduce emissions?
The mitigation side, a lot of those tools include transitioning to clean and renewable energy resources. For example, in the past several years, the costs of wind and solar and batteries, for example, have plummeted. And so transitioning to those clean and renewable energy sources, improving energy efficiency in our buildings and in our vehicles, reducing the end-use energy demand, and implementing sustainable practices, whether in our energy sector and our food systems, our agricultural sectors, to really get those emissions down. And we have a lot of the tools in place in the near term. And in the longer term, we're looking at additional options in terms of how we can further reduce emissions to really get to net zero by mid-century. And we've seen the benefits of research and development in terms of how they've reduced the costs and improved the efficiency of a lot of the technologies we have today, like wind and solar. And continuing to invest in R&D is how we'll get to a lot of these deeper reductions that are needed for mid-century.
And Siders, if I can turn to you, we know that even with these stringent mitigation measures, we're going to need to adapt to the impacts from all of our past emissions. So can you tell us more about the adaptation side of this equation? Where are we now, and what kind of actions are needed to address the risks that we're facing from climate change?
Yeah, I think the headlines these days make it really clear that we aren't prepared to deal with the heat, wildfire, floods, droughts, either the extreme events that we're seeing right now or how those events are going to get worse in the future. Incremental adaptation refers to small changes to business as usual. So imagine that a farmer facing a drought installs a better irrigation system. That's an adaptation to deal with drought, but it's a relatively minor one. It doesn't change the nature of the farm. A more transformative adaptation might suggest, let's reevaluate what crops we're farming. Or maybe we shouldn't farm water-intensive crops in an area that's facing extreme drought now and into the future. Or maybe we even think about not farming, but turning to some other type of economy. That would be a more transformative shift. One of the challenges with thinking more transformatively is that it can be inequitable. It can have even bigger changes if that sort of transformation, that shift in the fundamental system, doesn't take into account everyone's best interests. And so there's a concern that as we do more adaptation, it might make some of the equity concerns in our country worse.
I think the core takeaways that I would say from the mitigation side is that we have so many tools at our disposal right now to make really deep reductions. And we do need to accelerate progress. We need to both accelerate and expand the actions that we're doing and that we're deploying. But to get to net zero, we do have to also look at how we bring in more options. And so those options sometimes may be from the social science perspective for how we deploy solutions more broadly, but there is still work on the technological side as well in terms of what R&D is needed to get to that next set of solutions. We've seen the R&D and how it's led to plummeting costs of wind and solar and batteries, but there's more needs on the horizon to really get to net zero emissions. I think we're making really great progress, but we also can't let our guard down because we need to get to those net zero targets.
I think with adaptation, it's the same answer in that we need to expand the range of options that we are considering, that we need to do more of it and maybe take it a bit more seriously. And we need to keep in mind the opportunities, because there's a lot of work that can be made by showing people how they can reduce their risk to things like wildfire, floods, droughts, heat waves. But there's also a lot that can be done not from a place of fear, but from a place of opportunity, and showing them how these actions will both keep them safer and have more thriving communities, but also have opportunities to build something better for the future.
Coming up.
So the NCA Atlas is going to allow you, the user, to access whatever you want to know about. You get to pick the time frame, you'll get to pick the scenario, which future you want to look at, and you can produce those same images that you find in the National Climate Assessment.
USGCRP Executive Director Mike Cooperberg shares his thoughts on NCA5 and where we go from here.
In this last interview of our podcast series, there's no one better to speak to about the past, present, and future of the National Climate Assessments than Mike Cooperberg, the Executive Director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Welcome, Mike.
Hello, happy to be here.
It wasn't all that long ago that USGCRP, the Global Change Research Program, celebrated its 30th anniversary since its creation by Congress. And you've been leading USGCRP for a pretty good portion of those years, right?
Yes, yeah, almost 8 now.
Tell me a little bit about why you've stuck around USGCRP and what makes it such a special place.
So, Allison, let me tell you the personal side of that first. And the personal side is that I love this place. I was impressed with the office, with the organization, with what they were trying to do. And I always thought, it's like, I'd like to work in that organization. And I came here 8+ years ago. I think it's the best job in the world. And I'm thoroughly enjoyed being here. On a professional side, I think that climate change is one of the biggest challenges that faces humanity at the moment. And the U.S. Global Change Research Program's objective is to provide people with the information, the knowledge, the data, the tools they need to make informed decisions and to respond to global change. So you can't really figure out, you've got a great job, you got something that is challenging humanity, and we're happy to be here to try to help people make good decisions.
Not just climate change, global change, right?
It's a good point, and you'll hear me struggle with that. The U.S. Global Change Research Program was created to address global change, to address research coordination around global change. All sorts of things are changing around us, not just the climate. People are changing, land is changing, land use is changing. We're doing all sorts of things that change the world beyond just the physical climate.
Now, how has your own work, maybe, before or beyond USGCRP, shaped your perspective on climate change?
I often think back to my academic days and wonder about professors that I'd had and what they would think about what I'm doing here. I was trained as an ecologist. Ecology is a systems science. It's about how natural systems are built up and how they interact with each other. So it was a fairly easy and natural progression to move on to climate and global change, because ultimately it's all about interacting systems. It's about human energy systems, and it's about natural carbon cycles, and it's about cloud and aerosol dynamics, and it's about transportation systems. It really is an interacting systems science, and that's where the excitement is. That's where the excitement's always been, I think, and it's certainly where it is here with climate.
So let's move towards the National Climate Assessment specifically. We've heard a lot from our authors about their role on the National Climate Assessment, the impacts that they're talking about, and why they think the assessment is important. But I'd love your view on why the National Climate Assessment is so important to this country.
So I'd like to quote one of your earlier authors, and I probably won't get it exactly right, but Kate Marvel said, "This is only important to people who live on Earth." And I'm still smiling about that line. I wish I'd thought of it. This is the environmental issue of our time. It is, our energy systems, the whole way we live our lives is causing a problem for us with CO2 in the atmosphere. And we have got to figure out how to get past that, how to move on, and how to get to the next technology.
And how have you seen climate science, global change science, science assessments? How have you seen those evolve since you've been at USGCRP?
It's really interesting, Allison, because if you go back to reports that the Department of Energy put out in the 1970s, we had a pretty good understanding of what the role of carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere and what it meant for Earth and what it meant for temperature and how it would affect Earth. So on one hand, you can argue that we knew what was going on 50 years ago. And it turns out as our science gets better, as it gets more refined, as our understanding gets deeper and richer, we find out they were right. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and it does capture long-wave radiation and warm the Earth. But we're understanding the implications and the resolution of what that means for the entire Earth much, much better with each assessment. The message hasn't changed. And I think that's really, it's frightening and important and exciting. The message hasn't changed. The burning of fossil fuels is putting CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's warming the Earth, and that has all sorts of implications for us. What those implications are, that science is improving rapidly and drastically, and that means that engineers and farmers and regional water managers all have much better information with which to plan for the future.
I want to talk more about how USGCRP is evolving as well. Can you speak a little bit to how the priorities have changed either in our strategic plan or the inclusion of climate services. How has USGCRP evolved to meet those changing needs?
So first, I have to say that USGCRP's birthplace is in the coordination of basic science. Looking for answers where we may not even know what the questions are is what basic science is about. So let me start. We're always going to be there. That's critical. It's really, really important for the next generation of questions to make sure we have that broad and basic foundational information. Having said that, this question of, I believe you, what do we do next, is a challenge for us. And you're seeing that pivot. We're seeing that pivot happen right now. And more recently, you're seeing it in a real effort to expand USGCRP's coordination function into climate services. Climate services is this broad area of providing people with information. Think of the Weather Service, for example. You don't call a research meteorologist when you want to know if it's going to rain this afternoon. You go to the National Weather Service. We're thinking about the same thing with climate services, a source of information for the nation that gives you authoritative, dependable information on what the future is going to look like, what we expect it to look like.
Let's come back to NCA5 specifically. And I want to know what makes you most excited about NCA5.
I'm excited about something that NCA5 will have that we haven't done before called the Atlas. The NCA Atlas is an answer to a concern that I've had in the past. And that concern is that our understanding of what the world is going to look like in the future, you only get to see those parameters, those timescales, and those scenarios that we chose to show you. Where there's a much broader suite of information available to you, and there's a limit to how many figures we can put in the National Climate Assessment. So the NCA Atlas is going to allow you, the user, to access whatever you want to know about. You get to pick the time frame, you'll get to pick the scenario, which future you want to look at, and you can produce those same images that you find in the National Climate Assessment, but you'll get to pick whichever one you want to. And I think what's happening with the Atlas here is an illustration of what we're talking about with climate services. We want to make the information that we have as scientists available to everyone in the nation so they can make decisions. And we don't want to tell people, as scientists, we don't want to tell them what they need to do. We don't want to tell them what to look at. We want to tell them, here's what we understand about the future. Here's what we expect from the future. And then with that information, you can make decisions. That excites me.
I'm wondering what you would say to someone who's maybe listening right now and feeling overwhelmed or unsure about how they can make a difference. How would you recommend they take that first step towards meaningful climate action?
I can't start with anything except understanding. You need to understand the problem, and you don't have to be a scientist. And we've gone out of our way with the 5th National Climate Assessment to make it easy for you to understand whatever aspect of this issue you want to. We designed the National Climate Assessment so that you're not expected or supposed to read it. You don't start at the beginning and end at the end. It's an interactive information resource that you can tailor to your own needs. You can search it for whatever you're interested in, and all that information will be, the cross-cut across the whole report. You can find out whatever you want to know about fish or fruit or, whatever your topic is. It's in there in the National Climate Assessment, and it's built so that you can find the information without having to try to digest thousands of pages of information. So it's there for you. The National Climate Assessment stresses the fact that every degree matters, or maybe every 10th of a degree matters. Every small increment of action matters. And whether it's increasing temperature or whether it's decreasing your energy footprint, every action matters. Becoming informed, becoming knowledgeable, and taking steps. Every action you can take will make a difference and does make a difference. I have a lot of faith in human beings and our inventiveness and our cleverness. We've seen it in the past, and we'll see it again in the future.
As we've taken you on a trip through some of the findings of NCA5, I'm so glad that you were also able to meet some of the people who helped create this incredible resource. The 5th National Climate Assessment is an amazing product, and it's built as a labor of passion and service by the hundreds and hundreds of people who volunteer their time to create this critical source of climate information. thank you to all of our authors, technical contributors, review editors, support staff, agency partners, and reviewers for helping us build this amazing project. I hope that the National Climate Assessment will be your atlas or guide on climate change in the US. And maybe this podcast series has helped you take that first step on your own climate journey. Because there are many possible futures for our climate, our environment, our communities. Our choices today will guide how much more the planet continues to warm, how prepared we are for extreme weather events, and whether everyone can benefit equally from the transition to climate-ready communities. Our actions today will matter for generations to come. So whether you're a concerned citizen, a policymaker, a student, or anyone interested in the future of our planet, please join us on this adventure. NCA5 will be your partner in this journey. Let's harness the power of knowledge, ignite our collective imagination, be inspired by the people already taking climate action across the country, and work together to make a better, safer, more just nation. Speaking of inspiration, I want to turn one more time to the beautiful words of our U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon, reading her poem, Instructions on Not Giving Up.
More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crabapple tree, more than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs shoving their cotton candy-colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains. It's the greening of the trees that really gets to me. When all the shock of white and taffy, the world's baubles and trinkets, leave the pavement strewn with the confetti of aftermath. The leaves come. Patient, plodding, a green skin growing over whatever winter did to us, a return to the strange idea of continuous living, despite the mess of us, the hurt, the empty. Fine then, I'll take it, the tree seems to say, a new slick leaf unfurling like a fist to an open palm. I'll take it all.
That brings us to the end of our series. So as you go about your day today, please remember that your choices and your actions matter. Together, we can adapt and mitigate and innovate to address the climate crisis and meet the evolving needs of our changing world. On behalf of the entire U.S. Global Change Research Program and the National Climate Assessment teams, thank you for being a part of our community and for joining us on this podcast journey. Please be sure to share this podcast with others who are equally passionate about being a part of the climate solution, and please check out the report at nca2023.globalchange.gov. Thank you so much for listening.
The NCA5 Companion Podcast was produced by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. These podcasts are intended to provide context and perspectives from the authors and participants of NCA5. They do not represent official positions of the United States government. Production by Chris Avery and Allison Crimmins, who also served as host. Editing, mixing, and scoring by Mallory Hinks. Thank you to our guests, Dave Reidmiller, Zeke Hausfather, Julian Reyes, Rebecca Dotter, A.R. Siders, and Mike Cooperberg. Thank you to Eliza Lustig, Aaron Grade, Lori Howell, and Mike Cooperberg for their support in developing this series. Thank you also to Ada Limon, the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States, for providing her poetry to the project. The NCA is the U.S. government's premier report on climate change impacts, risks, and adaptation across the nation. It is a congressionally mandated interagency effort that brings together hundreds of experts from federal, state, and local governments, as well as the academic, nonprofit, and private sectors. Information about the NCA5, including the process used to create the assessment, can be found on the NCA5 website at nca2023.globalchange.gov.